Welcome to Lit Apple, your home for English literature and art education.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracing the foundational pillars of Western civilization. Look, you can think of ancient history as just a timeline of dead kings and ruined buildings, but it's actually this continuous, fascinating relay race of ideas. We're going to see exactly how the concepts governing our world today were born, tested, and totally transformed.
Let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We've got 6 parts today. First, the birth of epic poetry. Then, tragedy, comedy, and drama. Third, the Athenian democratic experiment, followed by the Athenian intellectual ecosystem. Fifth, Greece falls, Rome rises, and we'll wrap up with the Augustan Golden Age. Basically, we're mapping out how human thought progressed from divine intervention in ancient campfire epics all the way to the highly militarized governance of the Roman Empire.
All right, part 1, the birth of epic poetry. We're starting our journey with the absolute foundation of cultural memory, oral traditions, and the epic.
You know, before we had written language, let alone digital hard drives, we still needed a way to store our history and values. That's where epic poetry comes in. These elevated, formal narratives were recited by poets and bards, acting as the vital repositories of social values and collective identity. They weren't just stories, they were literally the glue that held early communities together.
This actually highlights the universal nature of the epic form beautifully. Just look at Homer's Iliad from Greece, compared to Vedvyasa's Mahabharata from India. The parallels are striking. In the Iliad, gods like Zeus and Apollo are actively driving plagues and manipulating heroes like Achilles. And over in the Mahabharata, you've got divine connections to Vishnu and powerful heroes like Bhima clashing in battle. Despite the massive geographic distance between them, both cultures use divine powers, vast settings, and heroic protagonists to explore the ultimate question of human destiny.
Moving on to part 2, tragedy, comedy, and drama. Let's see how this oral tradition takes its next massive leap, moving away from campfire recitations and right onto a structured civic stage.
So, Greek drama actually evolved from religious rituals dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. Eventually, tragedy became this highly sophisticated tool for a community to process really heavy emotions. Aristotle famously defined how this works. He pointed out that great tragedies rely on hamartia, which is a tragic flaw or an error that brings down a noble hero. But the end goal wasn't just to make everyone sad. It was about catharsis, an emotional purification that the audience experienced by feeling pity and fear together as a unified community.
But notice the stark contrast here between tragedy and comedy. While tragedy explored our fatal flaws and inevitable suffering through noble characters, comedy functioned as this vital social pressure valve. Comedies featured ordinary people and usually ended in a happy reconciliation. More importantly, it was a space for social satire. It was a place where everyday citizens could literally laugh at their own politicians and everyday problems.
Part 3, the Athenian democratic experiment. This culture of robust public drama perfectly mirrored the most radical political invention of the era happening right next door, direct democracy.
By the 5th century BCE, Athens had built a system completely unlike anything we see today. Today, we mostly have representative democracies, right? We elect politicians to make laws for us. But Athenians? They voted directly on legislation and war in the assembly. And here's the really fascinating part. The Council of 500, the group that set the daily agenda, wasn't elected. Members were chosen by lottery. They genuinely believed any ordinary citizen was capable of governing. And in the people's courts, there were no professional lawyers or judges. Citizens argued their own cases in front of massive juries of their peers.
However, to truly understand this era, we've got to look at the harsh reality of the system, the paradox of Athenian freedom. Because out of roughly 300,000 people living there, only about 10 to 15% actually had political rights. This so-called egalitarian utopia was entirely dependent on the exclusion of women who had no political rights whatsoever and the grueling labor of resident foreigners and enslaved people. Think about it. Without a subjugated labor force managing the economy, the male citizens simply wouldn't have had the leisure time required to spend their days debating in the courts and the assembly.
Part 4, the Athenian intellectual ecosystem. So, despite those deep internal inequalities we just talked about, the wealth flowing in from Athens' aggressive imperial expansion sparked an unprecedented intellectual golden age.
The brilliance of Athens wasn't just some accident of geography. It was an ecosystem. It thrived on parrhesia, which translates to free speech.
If you combine that political reality with the physical space of the agora, the bustling public marketplace, you get this incredible open-air incubator. People were constantly arguing legal cases and debating foreign policy. And in this environment of constant friction, traditional mythological explanations for the universe were slowly replaced by a brand new focus on logic and human reason.
This unique ecosystem naturally nurtured a progression of philosophical heavyweights. First, you have Socrates, the moral gadfly, who shifted philosophy completely away from cosmic guesswork and pushed it toward human ethics. He questioned absolutely everything, which unfortunately led the democratic state to execute him for corrupting the youth. His student, Plato, was deeply disillusioned by this mob rule, and he argued instead that society should be run by highly trained philosopher kings. And then came Plato's student, Aristotle. He was the master of empiricism who categorized the physical world and famously defined humans as political animals who literally need a city-state to reach their full potential.
Now, while all these philosophers debated down in the agora, the playwrights acted as the democratic conscience over at the theater of Dionysia. You had Sophocles exploring the terrifying clash between human ambition and unyielding divine law. Then there was Euripides, the subversive rebel. He stripped all the romance out of myths to aggressively critique the horrors of imperial war and give a voice to marginalized victims. And Aristophanes? He used brilliant, totally absurd comedy, like a famous play where women stage a sex strike to stop a war, to publicly mock Athenian leadership during actual, ongoing military crises.
Part 5. Greece falls, Rome rises. Because, as history so often shows us, brilliant philosophy and biting satire just can't stop physical armies. And that brings us to a massive transition of global power. The classical era of independent city-states eventually came to a crashing halt. First, Athens and Sparta totally exhausted each other in the devastating Peloponnesian War. This huge power vacuum allowed the Macedonians, specifically Philip and Alexander the Great, to sweep in and shift the world towards sprawling empires. Finally, a newly expanding, highly militaristic Roman Republic entered the scene. The definitive end came in 146 BCE, when Rome brutally sacked the city of Corinth, officially swallowing up Greece as just another Roman province.
Yet the story doesn't end with a simple military defeat. As the Roman poet Horace perfectly summarized it, captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror. See, Rome conquered Greece with swords, for sure, but Greek culture, philosophy, and literature utterly conquered the minds of the Roman elite. Wealthy Romans actually started sending their kids to Athens to study as a major status symbol. They absorbed Greek Epicureanism, Stoicism, and literary forms and completely adapted them for the Roman world.
Finally, Part 6. The Augustan Golden Age. This huge cultural absorption brings us to our final act. The sheer, massive scale of Roman military conquests ended up breaking its own republic. It turns out you simply cannot govern a transcontinental empire with the constitution of a small Italian city-state.
After a brutal series of civil wars, Julius Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, emerged as the sole ruler. But he had a massive problem. If he called himself a king or dictator, the Senate would assassinate him, exactly like they did to Caesar. So he masterfully engineered a constitutional illusion. In 27 BCE, he publicly surrendered his powers, taking the super humble title Princeps, or First Citizen. In return, a grateful, exhausted Senate gave him the name Augustus, and legally granted him supreme, overriding military command and absolute veto power. He pretended to restore the Republic, all while legally cementing his status as a sole autocratic emperor. Talk about a masterclass in political rebranding.
When we synthesize all of this, we can clearly trace the staggering evolution of the ancient world. We started with Athens, right? A small-scale, localized city-state defined by radical, direct democracy, where power was entirely driven by your ability to speak and debate in the public square. But over centuries, this shifted to Rome, a sprawling, transcontinental global empire, where governance completely morphed into autocracy, and power was strictly maintained through a professional standing army, complex patronage, and serious military discipline.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. We aren't just looking at ancient dust here, guys. The DNA of both these civilizations is alive and well in our modern institutions. So I leave you to ponder this. How are these foundational pillars of classical civilization, the Athenian desire for radical free speech and the Roman demand for imperial order and stability, still visibly fighting for dominance in our modern world today? Thanks so much for diving into this with me, and I really encourage you to keep questioning the history that built our present.
If you enjoyed this exploration of literature and art, please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon for updates.